Welcome, traveler of time. Before we begin, take a moment to find stillness in your breath, in your limbs, and in the hush that now surrounds you. Imagine the world slowing, as if time itself is taking a long exhale. And now, I invite you to listen closely, for tonight we begin a story wrapped in mist and mystery, drawn from the forgotten alleys of medieval France. Not of kings and crusades, not of plagues or peril, but of a clockmaker, a quiet man whose life ticked with secrets. This is the story of Émile Dufresne, the keeper of time in the shadow of Chartres Cathedral. Long ago, before the lanterns of Paris shimmered on the Seine, and before the printing press whispered inked truths across Europe, there stood the town of Chartres, a place carved in stone and prayer. Its cathedral, vast and hushed, was the pride of all who lived beneath its gaze. But even more mysterious than its stained glass or soaring spires was the clock that tolled within its tallest tower, a marvel of iron and breathless precision. It had no known maker, no drawings, no records. Only a man who emerged once, each dusk, to wind it a meal. The quiet one. Children feared him. Scholars dismissed him. But the priests, they let him pass with a nod, and that was enough. For Émile knew things others did not. You see, this clock did not merely measure time. It remembered it. Each cog turned not only minutes, but memories. Each pendulum swing kept secrets. And deep within the gears, something waited, as old as the cathedral stones. And just as silent. Each evening, Émile climbed the bell tower stairs, his lantern casting long shadows over stone worn smooth by centuries. The air there smelled of rust and incense, of candle soot and winter breath. And when he reached the top, he paused, always, just before unlocking the final door. Because that door was not always closed. Not for him. Sometimes, when the wind came from the north and the moon shivered behind clouds, the clock would unlock itself. The gears would turn just slightly, with no touch, and the great brass dial would shift, as if catching its breath. Tonight was such a night. Outside, the town of Chartres slept beneath quilts of smoke and frost, but inside the bell tower, something stirred. The clock hummed, softly, like it remembered something it should have forgotten. And Émile, thin and worn as parchment, reached for his tools, not with fear, but reverence. He had known since he was a child that this clock was no ordinary device. It had been passed to him not by blood, but by choice. The old keeper, Master Ulrich, had died without speaking, save for one whispered phrase, "The time that ticks backward," that was all. And Émile had carried those words like a coal in his pocket, warm and dangerous. Through wars and winters, through failed harvests and holy days, Émile had climbed the tower, wound the gears, and kept the silence. But tonight, he felt it, the shift. The gears moved before he touched them. The brass dial flicked just once, and pointed to an hour that did not exist. 13 o'clock. There is no 13th hour. Not on any clock in Christendom, but here, in the shadow of the cathedral, it glowed faintly for just a second, and then, silence. Émile closed his eyes. The 13th hour meant something. It meant a story was about to begin, far below. A young woman stepped off a carriage, wrapped in a traveling cloak dusted with snow. Her name was Isabeau, historian, unmarried, sharp of mind, quiet of voice. She had come to Chartres, not for pilgrimage or poetry, but for records, specifically a document lost in the year 1312, a scroll referencing a mechanism in the cathedral tower that commands not time, but truth. Scholars at the university in Orleans laughed when she asked, but one old monk had written her a single sentence in reply. "Come to Chartres on the feast of Saint Genevieve. Ask for a meal. Do not bring anyone." That feast was today, and Isabeau, persistent and precise, arrived at dusk, just as Émile climbed the final stair, and the 13th hour chimed once, unheard by all except them. In the tavern near the market square, the townsfolk were drinking spiced wine, huddled around fire pits, and telling old ghost stories about the clock that forgets to stop. "Once," said a bearded mason, "it struck 13, and the dead in the graveyard All turned their heads. "Bah," said a baker. "I heard it struck 13 during the siege, and the next day, the enemy dropped dead of fever." "Fools," whispered a washerwoman, her eyes clouded by cataracts. "It strikes 13 only when someone wakes up inside it." The others laughed. But in the tower, Emile paused. For the bell rope had pulled, itself. Chime, once. Soft, and low, 13:0. He turned to the great iron door behind the gears. The one no one had entered in centuries. And it was open now. "Dear listener, I must ask you, what would you do if you found a door open that should have been sealed for 600 years? If a clock struck an hour that does not exist? If a stranger arrived asking the same questions you never dared to ask aloud?" That is the night Emile faced. And it was only the beginning. In the tower that never slept, where candlelight flickered like thought itself, and every footstep echoed into old stone, Emile Dufresne stood with his lantern shaking in one hand and his breath caught in his throat. The iron door that should have stayed sealed rusted, heavy, and untouched since before his grandfather's grandfather was born, now gaped open by a finger's width. Not enough to see what lay beyond, but just enough to know something had stirred. The air beyond the gap was warmer than it should have been. It smelled not of dust and rot, but of oak wood and parchment tan old library's breath. And beneath that, something fainter, a floral trace, like pressed violets between pages. Emile, who had wound this clock every evening for 52 years, knew that what waited beyond was not meant for him alone. He did not enter, not yet. Instead, he turned slowly, closed the access panel to the gears behind him, and descended the spiral staircase in silence, each footfall softened by centuries of wear. He needed answers, and they would not come from metal or memory tonight. They would come from her. Isabeau de Voyer stood in the courtyard of the cathedral cloisters, her breath white in the air, fingers curled tightly around the brittle edges of a vellum page. The document, found wedged inside a forgotten binding at a monastery outside Dreux, was written in a Latin older than the monks who had buried it. But it was clear on one point. At the 13th toll, time forgets its name. Beneath the chiming lion, she waits. She noted that, and now, as the bells above chimed the final note of a hidden hour, she looked up to find Emile descending the cloister stairs toward her. He moved like the wind carved him, quiet, exact, worn by years. His coat smelled of brass and beeswax, and in the flickering torchlight, his eyes looked the color of tarnished copper. "You've come," he said. "Yes," she replied. "Did it happen?" Emile didn't answer. Instead, he gestured, and together they walked into the quiet belly of the cathedral. The nave was empty, save for candlelight and dust. Rows of pews lined up like old soldiers, each with wood polished by 1,000 bowed heads. Stained glass saints looked down with frozen eyes as the two figures passed beneath. "You knew this would happen," Isabeau said softly. "I knew it would." "Happen to someone," Emile replied. "I didn't know it would be you." She hesitated before speaking again. "Do you know what's behind the door?" Emile looked toward the altar. "No. But I know what's not behind it. Time. Whatever lies within is older than calendars, older than cathedrals, older than clockwork." Isabeau unfolded the vellum. "It speaks of a mechanism that remembers the truth of every hour. A memory machine, not just for keeping time, but for cataloging it." Emile nodded slowly. "And we've wound it every day without knowing what it stores." The two walked in silence, until they reached the winding stairs again. Emile held up a lantern, the light haloing them in warm gold as they ascended. It was a long climb, 122 steps, each one creaking beneath their weight. And with each turn of the spiral, the silence around them seemed to change, not deeper, but denser, as if sound itself had grown too heavy to rise with them. When they reached the top, the air was cooler again, and the iron door, still ajar. Emile placed a hand on the cold surface. "It hasn't opened in 600 years. And it opens tonight," said Isabeau, her voice steady. "Why?" Emile didn't speak. He simply pushed the door. It opened without. A sound beyond the door was not a chamber, but a passage. Narrow, low-ceilinged, lined in old brick that wept with condensation. The passage curved, descending slightly. Lit by no torch, yet dimly aglow with a silvery sheen like moonlight filtered through memory. They stepped inside, one after the other. The air grew warmer, thicker. There were no cobwebs here, no rats, no smell of mold or mildew, just the hum of something ancient, pulsing softly like a heartbeat, forgotten in stone. Isabeau held her breath as they rounded the final curve, and there it was, a room of gears, but not like the ones in the clock tower. Above, these were vast, intricate, arranged not vertically but horizontally, spiraling like the shell of a nautilus. At the center stood a pedestal. On it sat an orb, glass, or perhaps crystal, suspended without touch, rotating slowly in the air. Etched around its surface were symbols. Not numbers, not letters, but fragments, moments. The first cry of a newborn, a torchlit procession, a sword breaking in mid-swing, a kiss beneath snowfall. Each image shimmered into the next, playing across the orb, like dreams in a restless mind. Isabeau stepped closer. "This is no timepiece," she whispered. "It's an archive." Emile approached the outer gears, his fingers moving almost of their own accord. He did not wind them. He listened to them, as if the metal whispered back. And perhaps it did. For the gears slowed at his touch, the orb pausing mid-spin, and a single image solidified on its surface. A cathedral, but not the one above them. Older, cracked by weather, overgrown with ivy, its windows dark, and standing before its door, a child in robes far too large for her, holding a key. Isabeau stared. "Who is she?" Emile replied. "I think that's you." "No, I've never." And then the orb shimmered again, flickering forward. Now, it showed a library in flame, a monk running, scrolls thrown from a window, and in the smoke, a sigil, the same as the one on the vellum she had brought. The sigil of the 13th Hour Society. They turned from the orb together. "This place," said Isabeau, "was meant to be found by someone who remembered what others forgot." Emile looked at her then, not with suspicion, but with strange relief. "Then you're ready," he said. "For what?" But the gears began to move again. Not by hand, not by crank. By will, and in the hum, a door opened, not behind them, but within the gears, beyond it, a staircase, descending deeper still. "You don't have to follow," Emile said. But Isabeau was already stepping forward, her boots echoing against stone, her eyes wide, her hands trembling not from fear, but from understanding. She had come for knowledge, but what she found was a door into memory itself, and down they went, into the heart of the cathedral. Beyond clockwork and architecture, beyond saints and sermons, into the part of time no one believed could be entered. And so, dear listener, let the world hush around you. Let the gears slow. Let the candles burn low. Tonight, we have entered the place between seconds, the archive between heartbeats. The 13th hour is no longer a legend. It is here, and our story has just begun. The staircase curled downward like a ribbon carved into bedrock, each step smoothed by centuries of use or intention. There were no torches here, no lanterns, no light from above, and yet the air shimmered faintly around them, touched by a silvery luminescence that seemed to come from the stone itself. Isabeau descended first, her hand brushing the cold wall, each breath slow and measured, as though she feared exhaling might wake something deeper still. Behind her, Emile walked with the calm of someone returning home, not surprised, not hurried, as though he had always known this path existed, even if he had never dared tread it. No one had spoken for some time. There was no need. The silence here was not emptiness, it was presence. The descent was long. Neither of them counted the steps, though the number might have mattered in another. Place here, all measurements unraveled. Seconds from hours, hours from days. Only the rhythm of their footsteps remained, like a slow heartbeat echoing into memory. At last, the stairs gave way to level ground. They stood before a great archway, carved into stone, etched with symbols neither Latin nor French. curves and lines that shimmered as if written in breath. The door itself was absent, but a veil of cold air passed over them as they crossed the threshold. And then, they entered the archive. It was vast and quiet. Not with the silence of nothingness, but the silence of accumulated time. The chamber stretched farther than the eye could follow, its ceiling vanishing into mist. Pillars rose like petrified trees, their trunks wrapped in thin bands of brass. Between them stood towers of glass and stone, within which floated thin slivers of light, like memories trapped in crystal. The floor beneath them shimmered with a mirror-like sheen, reflecting not only their bodies, but echoes of something else, a flicker of movement just behind their shoulders, a flash of clothing not worn in centuries, a child's laughter far away. "This place," Isabeau murmured. "It remembers." Emile said nothing. He simply walked forward, his fingers brushing the edge of a nearby crystal panel. It flared faintly under his touch, and an image appeared within, grainy, sepia-toned, but unmistakable. A battlefield, a knight, his sword shattered, a banner falling, and beneath it, a priest writing in a small black ledger. "It stores history," Emile whispered. "But not as we've written it. It stores what truly happened." Isabeau stepped beside him. Not versions, not accounts, just truth. He nodded. Truth the world forgot, or chose to forget. They moved deeper into the archive. Occasionally, a panel would glow as they passed, sometimes showing mundane scenes, a baker kneading dough, a woman reading by candlelight, a child sweeping ash from a hearth. Other times, the panels showed horrors, cities burning, masks of plague, fields covered in snow and blood. "This is why they built the cathedral above it," Emile said, "to hide it, to sanctify what they couldn't understand." Isabeau frowned. "And the clock, it wasn't built to keep time." "No," Emile replied softly. "It was built to protect this place, to lock it, to wind it shut." Further in, the archive changed. The stone grew darker, the reflections deeper, the air heavier. They arrived at a central chamber, circular, domed, ringed by 12 statues. Each was cloaked and faceless, their hands outstretched, palms up, as though offering something invisible. In the center stood a pedestal with a single item resting on it. A key. It was old, made of bone, threaded with silver, and it pulsed. Isabeau reached for it, but Emile stepped between. "Not yet." She looked at him. "Why?" He glanced toward the statues. "Because to take the key is to unlock the hour that never was." Isabeau furrowed her brow. "The 13th hour," Emile nodded. "It's not just a myth, is it?" "No." He walked slowly around the circle, touching each statue's hand in turn. "Each of these figures represents a guardian, one from each century since the archive was sealed. Most never knew their role. Some died before the hour struck. Others went mad. Only a few ever made it this far." "Why me?" Isabeau asked. Emile's eyes met hers. "Because you remembered, you listened, and the archive listens back." Isabeau stared at the key. "I dreamt of it," she whispered. "When I was 12. A key made of bone and light. My mother said it was just fever. But I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, and I drew the same sigil from the vellum, weeks before I ever saw it. The archive calls to those who are ready," Emile said, "but it only opens for those who are necessary." She reached again. This time, Emile did not stop her. Her fingers closed around the key. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, and the statues moved not a step, not a breath, but the faintest tilt of their heads toward her, as though watching, waiting. The room pulsed once, then again, and the floor beneath the pedestal began to open. Below lay a spiral of stone steps, older than the ones before, cruder, uneven. They led downward again, not into earth, but into something deeper. "This is the vault," Emile said. "The final chamber." "Final?" she asked. He did not answer. They began to descend. Here, the silence was complete. Even their footsteps made no sound, and the walls no longer reflected anything. It was not lightless, but sightless, like the world had forgotten what it meant to be seen when they reached the bottom. The space opened into a narrow corridor lined with mirrors, but these did not show reflections. Instead, they showed possibilities. In one, Isabeau was a child again, sitting in the sunlit ruins of an abbey, laughing. In another, she stood alone in the bell tower, the city below her in flames. Emile watched her carefully. This chamber shows the choices not taken, the truths we buried, and the futures we feared. She turned to him, and what lies at the end? He hesitated. The one memory the world is not ready to remember. And why show it to me? Because the archive believes it's time. They reached the final room. No door. Just a veil of hanging mist. Isabeau stepped through first, and what she saw was not of this world. A sky of stars not yet born. A city built of spirals and sound, and at its center, a tower made not of stone, but of time itself, moments, stitched together into walls, and within it, a second Isabeau, older, wiser, standing before an open book whose pages wrote themselves. This was not a vision. It was a recording of what had not yet come to pass. A memory waiting to be made. Isabeau stood breathless. Emile stepped beside her, his voice quiet. You see now, the archive does not record the past. It records the true shape of time, and it has chosen you to write the next chapter. Above, the bell tower stood silent. The clock hands pointed toward midnight. But beneath the cathedral, time had bent to reveal not what was, but what must be, and Isabeau de Voyer had become its author. The mist parted as if reluctant, its pale tendrils curling behind Isabeau and Emile, like soft fingers grasping at the silence they left behind. The chamber before them glowed dimly not with torchlight, but with the quiet radiance of knowledge. Held too long, it was not a room in the usual sense. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor that could be trusted to be stone. It felt like they were standing inside a breath, or inside the pause between waking and dream. All around them, glass-like, panels hovered in space, weightless, soundless, their edges glowing faintly in a color without name. Upon each one played a scene, not just from history, but from possibility. One panel showed Emile as a boy, kneeling before a dismantled timepiece, his fingers dirt-stained and trembling with wonder. Another showed Isabeau as a woman in robes of midnight blue, standing atop the very tower they had descended from, but it was in ruins, and the city around her was ash. This isn't memory, she whispered, her voice barely audible. This is what could be, Emile nodded. The archive stores not just what happened, but what almost happened. What never happened, what must not. A panel shifted behind them. Neither had touched it, but it responded, sliding into view like a curious bird. Within it, a moment yet to come. Isabeau, alone, the key in her hand. A door before her larger than any they had seen. And behind that door, not light, not shadow, but stars moving backward. She felt a shiver travel the length of her spine. Why show us this? She asked. Because the archive is not only a vault, Emile replied. It is a question, and we are the answer. He looked at her, weary and old and lit from within. I was never meant to be the answer, only the one who kept the question safe. Until you arrived. They walked onward, though no path guided them. Their steps led toward the center not marked, not signed, but known. The way a bird knows where to migrate, or a candle knows how to die. The mist around them parted once more, and they came into a new chamber, this one different, smaller. Stone-walled, more real than the ether behind them. It was shaped like a chapel, with a single seat at its heartened ancient wooden chair. Carved with tiny gears and vines, the wood worn smooth by centuries of touch. Above the chair hovered a disk of crystal. It spun slowly, casting pale reflections. Across the walls, etched around its edge, in looping script, were the words, "She who remembers what was forgotten may rewrite what must be." Emile placed a gentle hand on the chair's back. This was the scripter's seat, he said. The one who sits within is not merely witness, but keeper. What they write becomes record. What they record becomes real. Isabeau stepped forward, but Emile caught her wrist. Are you certain? he asked, voice soft but firm. You may still walk away. Leave this place untouched. Let time forget you. She looked at the crystal disc, spinning above the chair, then down at the key in her palm still. Warm, still pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat in bone. No, she said. I was born remembering things no one told me. I see things that haven't happened yet, and I've been waiting my entire life for a door I couldn't name. She sat. The moment her body touched the seat, the room sighed, not metaphorically, but truly a long, slow exhalation from the stones themselves, as though they had held their breath for generations. The crystal disc above her stopped spinning. The mist outside the chamber fell still, and in that stillness, a voice came not spoken, but felt. Scribe of the forgotten hour, you may now speak memory into matter. Isabeau didn't flinch. She only closed her eyes, and saw. She saw the truth of Chartres, the city above, with its narrow streets and cold chimneys, but the city beneath, ancient and sacred, built on bones and broken stars. She saw the first builders of the cathedral, who did not build it for worship, but for containment. The tall, quiet men in blue robes, who carved symbols into the stone before language had a name. She saw the 12 guardians, one for each century, chosen not by birth, but by remembering, each found in different ways, one while dreaming in a plague tent, another while drowning in a well and breathing visions instead of water, another still, a child abandoned on a monastery step, who spoke fluent Latin by age 3, though no one had taught her. She saw Emile, 50 years ago, entering the tower for the first time, a boy of 16, orphaned by fire, drawn by a sound. Only he could hear a ticking in the wind. He had wound the clock ever since, but never opened the door until now, until her, and then she saw a new future, a rupture in the sky above the cathedral, a bell that tolled once, then never again. People forgetting their own names, their own years, calendars cracking, seasons colliding, the fabric of time unspooling, as though the great clock had stopped and the archive no longer cared to remember, and, at the center of it all, a door, the one she had seen in the mirrored corridor, waiting for the key she now held. She opened her eyes. Tears traced her cheeks, though she had not felt them fall. Emile knelt beside her. What did you see? She pressed the key into his palm. Not what we must do, but what we must prevent. He nodded slowly, and the key, she stood. It doesn't open the future. It closes it, locks it in place, keeps it from unraveling. But to use it, Emile said carefully, you would have to leave the archive, lock it behind you, forget what you've seen. Isabeau smiled, a sad, soft curve of her lips. Some knowledge isn't meant to be kept. It's meant to guide, then vanish. They left the chamber. As they walked, the archive began to shift. Panels turned dark, the gears slowed. The mirrors showed only their reflections, now no more visions, no more might-have-bins. The archive, it seemed, was preparing for sleep. At the great spiral vault, where it had all begun, Emile paused. You could stay, he said gently. Become its next keeper. The archive would welcome you. But Isabeau looked upward, the staircase that led back to stone and sky and breath. No, she said. It's time I lived in my own time, not someone else's. Memory. She pressed her palm to the door. It opened slowly, reverently, and for the first time since they entered, the faint sound of birdsong filtered down from above. Morning, real morning. They ascended, step by step, toward light in the bell tower. The great gears had stilled. The hands of the clock stood at 12. Not noon, not midnight, just 12. The 13th chime had passed, its work complete. Emile turned one last time to the cathedral below, the archive beneath. The centuries locked in silence, and Isabeau stepped into the dawn. The sun caught her hair. The cobblestones felt warm beneath her feet. The world, as far as it knew, had not changed. But somewhere, far below, in a chamber no one remembered, a door closed, a key turned, and the archive exhaled its final breath. The streets of Chartres had not changed. Not visibly. The towers still caught the morning sun in their copper crosses. The pigeons still danced in the squares, as vendors unrolled bolts of fabric and baskets of dried lavender. The cathedral's shadow still stretched long across the market stones, and the bell tower still stood silent, its great iron voice unstruck. But for Isabeau, the world had altered. She moved through the narrow alleys like someone returned from sleep, not dazed, but hushed, as if the world itself had dimmed around her, and only her memory now knew the true color of things. She paused by the fountain near Rue Saint-Pierre, the same spot she had often passed without thought. But now, the fountain's basin looked different, not in shape, not in size, but in tone, like something older slept beneath it. A hum, just below hearing. She crouched beside it, placed a palm on the stone lip. It was cool, but beneath that coolness, a slow, steady warmth, like a heartbeat. Another gate, she whispered. The archive had not left her, though she had closed the door, walked up into the light, and stepped into the familiar breath of the city. Something within her had shifted. Not knowledge, though, there was that too, but a sense. A subtle perception of threads the eye could not see, moments, suspended like cobwebs between buildings, woven across time. She could feel it now. The memory of the city, not just the buildings, but the stones, the windows, the alleys that curved, like forgotten thoughts. Isabeau looked up. A cat, perched on a window ledge, stared at her still as a statue. But she saw its reflection in the glass. And in that reflection, it was not a cat, but something older. A carved lion, its mouth open, water once gushing from its lips. She blinked, and it was a cat again, at the edge of the town, where the ancient walls still bore scars from sieges long. Erased from common memory, she followed a whisper, not a sound, but a sensation. The way birds feel a storm before the first cloud forms. There, behind an ivy-choked gate, she found it. A small stone circle, half buried in moss. It was no larger than a dinner plate, etched with a spiral of symbols she knew now by heart. She knelt, traced her fingers over the glyphs, and as she did, the ground beneath her shimmered, not moved, not opened, but remembered. It showed her a moment, a monk, kneeling in that same spot, planting the stone, whispering a vow. When the 13th chime falls silent, the remembering must begin. That night, Isabeau dreamt. She stood in a corridor made of water. The floor rippled. The walls pulsed like veins. And above her head, stars drifted slowly in a spiral. Voices spoke not in language, but in feelings. There are more stones, more moments, more truths. The archive beneath the cathedral was only the beginning. She awoke, with her hand clenched around something cold. It was a coin, small, silver, etched with the face of a king she'd never seen in any book, and around its edge, the sigil of the archive. She returned to Emil's workshop before dawn. The shutters were drawn. The bell tower loomed silently above, its gears at rest. Inside, the dust had already begun to settle again, as though the wind had sighed it back into place. Emil sat by the window, unmoving, his gaze distant. "You felt it too," Isabeau said softly. He nodded. "The archive may have closed, but its breath still lingers." She sat across from him and placed the coin between them. It glinted dully in the lamplight. "Do you know what this is?" Emil nodded slowly. "A marker, left by those who built the memory roads. They placed them across Europe, beneath cities, beneath seas, some say even in the roots of mountains, a map. But only for those who remember, and you. I've only ever heard stories. You are the first to return with one." They unrolled old maps across the workshop floor. Not the ones sold to tourists or studied by modern historians. These were fragile, drawn in ink faded to rust, the vellum crinkled and translucent. Some showed Chartres. Others showed pieces of something larger, a net, cast wide across time. Isabeau found it first. A series of markings, identical spirals. Always near rivers, always near churches. "There are 12, she said. Emil pointed to the edge of the map, and one more, off the coast. Beneath the sea. The 13th, she whispered. He nodded. But no one knows if it's real. The others are reachable, traceable, but the 13th was never meant to be found, she finished. And so it began. Not a quest, not a journey, a remembering. Isabeau walked the city as the days passed, listening, watching beneath archways, beneath bridges, in the quiet between bell tolls. She found them, markers, small, hidden. Whispering, each one showed her a fragment, a birth long forgotten, a betrayal in candlelight, a promise made and broken beneath the cathedral's eaves. She began to draw them, a ledger of memories that had no date, and the more she found, the clearer the pattern became. The archive had not closed its eyes. It had only turned its gaze outward. One evening, as dusk folded over the spires and smoke rose soft from the chimneys, Emile met her by the river. He held an envelope, yellowed, wax-sealed, no name. It was left at the bell tower's door. No one saw who placed it. Isabeau opened it carefully. Inside, a single sheet of paper, unmarked, until she breathed upon it. And then ink bloomed, a circle, a sigil, and beneath it, words, to know. The 13th, you must first walk the 12. Each stone is a door, each memory, a key. Begin in Prague. She looked up at Emile, heart quiet but certain. So it spreads, she said. Not just in this city, but across the old world. Emile placed a hand on her shoulder. The archive was never meant to stay buried. It was meant to wake. And in the clock, tower high above, as the wind turned colder, and the pigeons settled in their wooden coves, the great bell moved, just slightly. Not enough to ring. Not enough to be noticed. Just enough to remember. The train whispered its way through the French countryside, its windows blurred with rain and dusk. Isabeau sat alone, her fingers wrapped gently around the envelope that had brought her here. Its paper was thinning with wear, soft along the folds. The symbol inked upon it, a spiral within a spiral, within a spiral, remained dark and unbroken, like a watchful eye that never blinked. Prague at the word had repeated in her dreams for nights now. Not spoken, not shouted, but murmured like a hymn. Prague, Prague, Prague. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw cobblestone streets that curled like smoke, archways carved with faces that watched and waited. She saw a tower narrow, veined with frost, and beneath it, a circle of stones embedded in the ground, not part of the pavement, not part of the world above, but keys, sleeping in the earth. She arrived beneath a sky without stars. Prague was wrapped in fog, the air rich with the scent of coal smoke, roasted chestnuts, and ancient stone that had forgotten its own builders. The vault of a river moved like a black ribbon through the city, silent and smooth. Above it, bridges stretched like time crossed by those who never looked down, never noticed the water, remembering. Isabeau moved quietly through the night. No destination, just a direction pulled by something within her bones. And when the fog opened just enough, she saw it, a tower of forgotten hours. It stood at the edge of the old town square, leaning slightly, cloaked in grime, its roof a tangle of dark shingles and copper wires. No signs adorned its base. No tourists stood near. It was asleep in plain sight. She approached, her boots tapping softly on the stone. No door, no knocker. Just an archway with a faded etching above it barely visible in the dim light. Those who remember may enter. Those who forget may pass by. She placed a hand on the arch. Cold, damp, and alive. A click, a breath, a slow unfolding, and the door opened. Inside, darkness, not heavy, not cruel, but deep. Old, the kind of dark that holds lullabies, that knows every secret ever whispered to a dying fire, that greets you not with fear, but with recognition. Isabeau stepped in, and the door closed behind her. The floor sloped downward. A spiral staircase led into earth. Each step was carved, not of stone, but of interlocking gears, silent, unmoving, each tooth fitting perfectly with the next. As she descended, faint lights blinked into being along the walls, teeny candles trapped in glass spheres, floating without wick or wax dot at the bottom. A chamber of mirrors. Not literal mirrors, but reflective surfaces that shimmered when she passed each. One showing not her face, but moments. A hand holding a broken timepiece. A girl sketching a circle in snow. A pair of gloves embroidered with constellations. And in the center of the room, the stone it was embedded in the floor smooth, black, and veined with silver. Etched into its surface was a spiral, identical to the one from Chartres. Surrounding it, 12 small marks. One glowed faintly, the mark of Chartres. The rest slept. Isabeau knelt beside it. She placed her hand on the center spiral, and the room breathed. Not sound. Not air. Memory. She was no longer in Prague. She stood on a rooftop centuries ago. Snow fell gently, covering statues and steeples. The city beneath her burned not in flames, but in fever. Red crosses marked doorways. Bells rang not for prayer, but for death. Beside her stood a man cloaked in fur and silence. His eyes were pale, his hands gloved, on his belt, a key. "The first memory is not yours," he said. "It belongs to the builder. But you may borrow it." He opened his palm, a silver coin, identical to the one Isabeau had found in Chartres. "To awaken the next stone," he whispered, "you must walk where time has bent." He pointed across the city, to the astronomical clock. The vision broke like water. "Dropped from height," she gasped. The chamber returned. Her hand still rested on the stone, now warm. And the second mark glowed faintly. The second door. Waiting outside, Prague had not noticed her absence. The fog still clung to rooftops. The clocks still ticked in their towers. Lovers still kissed beneath lanterns. The world turned slowly, as if through syrup. But Isabeau moved with purpose now. She crossed the bridge of statues, their stone eyes closed against the weight of memory. She passed beneath arches that whispered old names, and soon she stood beneath the face of the ancient clock. Its dials turned slowly, sun and moon chasing each other in painted gold. At the base, she found it a gear, embedded in the stone. Not part of the mechanism, not part of any map, but a marker. She knelt and whispered, "I remember." A low tone, soft like breath, across glass. The gear turned once, and in the clock's highest window, a shutter cracked open. Something inside stirred. Not a figure, not a statue, but a voice, not heard aloud, but deep within her. "This is only the second. There are 10 more stones, then the 13th. But beware. Not all who remember wish the archive to wake." She turned, and for a moment, she saw him, a figure at the edge of the square, dressed like any passerby, coat, hat, gloves, but his eyes reflected stars that hadn't risen yet, and in his hand, a page torn from a book. Even from across the distance, Isabeau could see the drawing on it, her face. Then he was gone. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she returned to the tower marked. The second glow on her map noted the direction of the next stone. Vienna, the pattern was forming. The path was remembering itself, and she at its center was no longer just a keeper of memory. She was a scribe of waking time. Beneath Prague, the stone dimmed again, but not to sleep, to wait. For the next who would come. For the next who would remember. The train rolled gently eastward again, carving a silver line through winter's hush. Isabeau sat by the frost-fogged window, her breath warming small circles in the glass. Outside, the countryside unfolded in frozen stillness, bare trees bowing under the weight of snow, stone villages wrapped in white, and skies the color of pewter. Time here did not rush. It drifted, like snow falling on yesterday's footprints. She held the map in her lap and folded, like a secret never meant to be. Spoken aloud. 2 marks glowed now. Chartres, Prague. The third waited. Vienna. But unlike before, the path felt heavier, not dangerous, but watched. She remembered the man in the square, the page in his hand, her face drawn in graphite lines. He had not followed her, but his memory walked beside her now, a quiet companion whose name she did not yet know. Vienna received her with grace and silence. It was twilight. The snow here was finer, soft as silk, falling through gaslight shadows that stretched long. Across the cobblestones, horses moved slowly through the quiet lanes, their hooves muffled by straw and snow. Music drifted faintly from the open windows of townhouses. Waltzes played on pianos that remembered better times. But Isabeau heard something else. Not music, not bells. A pulse, subterranean, subtle. A rhythm hidden beneath the city's frozen bones. She made her way to the old quarter. The streets narrowed, and time curled like smoke in the corners. Her footsteps echoed off buildings gilded with frost. Facades that wore centuries like shawls, and they're tucked behind a chapel whose roof sagged like a sigh. She found a door, iron rusted, carved with the same spiral. It opened before she touched. Inside, the chamber descended. Stone steps coiled in silence, leading her underground. The air grew colder with each step, not dead, but dense, heavy with the weight of unspoken things. The room at the base was not like Prague's mirror vault. This was a library, but no books lined its shelves. Instead, fragments, clocks broken open, and pinned like butterflies. Gears suspended midair. Strings of copper wire coiled like veins, pulsing faintly with stored memory. And in the center, a bell cracked, hung from nothing, its tongue missing. She approached, slowly. On the wall beside it, etched into the stone, a phrase in Latin, memoria. Est campanaque, sonat, in silentio. Memory is the bell that rings in silence. She placed her fingers on the bell. It was ice, and then warm, and then a sound. Soft, deep, not heard by the ears, but felt in the marrow. She closed her eyes, and the city changed. She stood on a balcony. High above Vienna centuries ago, the snow still fell. But the world below was aflame with candlelight and song. A masked ball spun in the palace below her. Gilded masks, laughter, the scent of perfume and pine. A man stepped beside her, tall, pale, gloved in black. He offered no greeting. He simply opened his hand, and in it, a stone, black, etched with a spiral. "The third," he said. She reached out to take it, but the world shuddered. A cry echoed from the streets. Then another, and another. The revelers stopped dancing, and in the distance, bells began to toll, one after another. "It always begins with joy," the man whispered, "but ends with forgetting." She tried to speak, but her voice was swallowed by wind. She awoke in the chamber. Again, her hand still rested on the bell, and now, the wall across from her glowed faintly. Not a full light, just a shimmer, a path, half-dash revealed. She traced it with her fingers. Budapest that night. She did not return to any inn. She walked Vienna's silent streets. Listening at St. Stephen's, the great bell tower watched her. A child passed her in the square and stopped, offering her a folded paper before darting away. Without a word, she unfolded it. It was not a letter, it was a sketch of the bell she had just touched, drawn in perfect detail. Even the crack on the bottom, a single word, "not alone." The snow deepened, the clocks slept, the horses vanished into alleys. She stood beneath a bridge that curved low across the frozen canal, and watched the water dream in stillness. For a moment, she saw her own reflection rippling behind it, the face of someone else, not the man from Prague. Someone younger, eyes wide with questions, holding a mirror, offering it like a gift. She turned, no one there, only the city, breathing, waiting, before she left Vienna. She climbed to the very top of the cathedral. It was forbidden, locked, but the key she'd found in Prague, the one that had no drawer. Into the rusted gate without effort. The wind met her with open arms. The city stretched out before her in all directions, a frozen compass of rooftops, towers, and roads. But she saw it now, the pattern, not random, the locations, the archive, the stones. They were not scattered. They were positioned, like the points of a clock, and the 13th was the center. She descended slowly, mind quiet but full. Emile had once said, "Each archive breathes differently. Some whisper, some remember aloud." Vienna did neither. Vienna watched, and as Isabeau stepped back into the snow-drifted square, she realized the city had marked her. She was no longer merely tracing memory. She was becoming part of it, a thread sewn into the archive itself. She boarded the train before dawn. The fourth mark had begun to glow. Her map trembled faintly in her hands, as if the paper knew what came next. Budapest. Another voice. Another bell. Another door. But now, the silence around her had grown dense. The kind that presses in from all sides. The kind that signals not rest, but awakening. Beneath Vienna, in the chamber of the broken bell, a shape stirred. Not a person, not a ghost. Memory reclaimed. It opened its eyes without light, and it began to move, not toward her, not yet, but into position, like a hand reaching for a clock's final gear. The train crossed the border into Hungary, beneath a black sky lit only by the sleeping fires of distant towns. Budapest lay ahead, tucked along the Danube like a memory folded into the bank of time. The city had its own rhythm, one that hummed beneath its bridges, echoed in its baths, and sighed through the frostbitten silence of its midnight boulevards. Isabeau barely slept as the train whispered across the night. Each archive awakened, made her more sensitive to the passage of hours. She could feel time now as a temperature, a texture, a throb in her fingertips. It wasn't painful, not yet, but it was changing her. When she arrived, Budapest was painted. In quiet shadows, snow flurried lazily through golden lamps, and the Danube flowed like glass, veined with ink. She moved through the city with no map, only instinct. She crossed Chain Bridge, the lions at its gates, silent in their vigil. Buda Castle loomed above the river, like a sleeping crown, its windows shuttered to the past. And somewhere beneath it all, she felt the pulse again, not of blood, of memory. She found the entrance tucked in the underbelly of a ruined thermal bath. No name marked the threshold. Only a single lantern hanging above the archway, a metal cage of interwoven spirals, and inside it, a flame that did not flicker. She stepped closer. The lantern exhaled a breath of warm air, scented with lavender, ash, and something older than smell of paper burnt long ago. As she reached out, the flame did not retreat. It bowed. The doorway opened without a sound. This chamber was unlike any she'd yet encountered. No stairs. No mirrors. No bells. Instead, a long corridor, narrow and damp. Walls lined with riveted metal, etched with constellations that shifted subtly when not watched. The air shimmered faintly, and from far ahead, a soft hum, not mechanical, not musical, but living. She walked, her footsteps left no echo. The corridor bent in slow spirals, and finally, it opened into a vast chamber round, domed, lined with water, an underground lake at its center. A small stone platform, floating impossibly above the surface, suspended over it by a single thread of golden wire, a lantern, not like the one at the door. This one burned with blue fire. She stepped onto the lake's edge. A narrow bridge unfolded itself, one plank at a time, as if sensing her presence. With each step forward, the water beneath shimmered with images, reflections of other cities, other lives, other dreams half remembered. She saw Prague's square, Chartres Cathedral, her grandmother's hands. Each image dissolved as her foot passed over, and then she was there beneath the lantern. It lowered slightly, responding to her breath. Inside the flame, a shape, a gear, tiny, turning slowly, and then, like a dream slipping into her skin, she saw a boy, alone, hidden beneath floorboards, listening as footsteps above grew frantic, listening as his family was taken. In his hand, a pocket watch, not working, but he held it close like a relic. And then, a door opening, a figure stepping down, a woman, eyes full of sadness, hands wrapped in gloves. She knelt, lifted the floorboard, and whispered, "Time must be carried, even when it breaks." She handed him a lantern, this very lantern. When the clocks fall silent, light this, it will remember. Isabeau gasped, her own hands now tingled. The lantern above her pulsed, then slowly dimmed. The flame inside still burned, but now, the gear glowed gold, and the fourth mark on her map, Budapest, lit up. As she stepped back across the bridge, The chamber began to change. Water rose gently. The domed ceiling peeled open like petals of iron. Above, she saw the night sky. But not tonight's sky. A sky from before. The constellations were wrong. Familiar, but out of place. The stars realigned to form a shape, a circle of cities. At their center, nothing, but from that nothing, a whisper. 5 stones. 8 remain. The 13th is not a place. It is a choice. She left the bath as dawn broke. Snow covered the streets now, and on a nearby bench, someone had left a newspaper. She picked it up. On the front page, a photograph, a fire. A building burned in Vienna. She read the caption, "Historic chamber beneath. Cathedral collapses. Cause unknown. No casualties reported." But she knew. The archive was moving, or someone was moving through it. As she boarded the next train, bound for Krakow, the map trembled in her pocket, and this time, for the first time, she was afraid, not of the stones, but of what happened when all of them awakened. The snow in Krakow fell differently. Not in flurries, not in sheets, but in slow, deliberate spirals, as if time itself was turning downward from the sky. Each flake landed like a whisper on the old rooftops, on the crooked spires, on the trembling fingers of dawn. Isabeau stepped off the train and into a city that remembered. Not in words, not in echoes, but in rhythm. Krakow had a heartbeat slow, thunderous, buried. It pulsed underfoot as she walked through the half-lit streets, past the cloth hall, and through alleys that hadn't changed in 500 years. The stones beneath her boots were old enough to have forgotten kings and remembered whispers. This was not a city that shouted its history. It simply carried it, like a song humming beneath its breath. She had no address, but her hands knew where. To go through the market square, silent in early light. Past the Church of St. Mary, where 2 towers leaned like conspirators over centuries. And down a lane so narrow she could touch both walls with outstretched arms. There, half buried in frost, was a brass plate, polished by time. Engraved with a spiral, and beneath it, a word, Chesonia, the time house. She pressed her palm to the plate. It was warm, a click, a sigh. A door opening sideways into the wall revealing stone steps, spiraling downward like a corkscrew. Through bone, she descended. Each step dimmed the world above. Each step thickened the silence. She heard no footsteps but her own. No sounds but the deepening drumbeat of something ancient stirring beneath Krakow's roots, and then she reached it. The archive of Krakow. It was not a chamber. It was a machine, she gasped, a cathedral-sized cavern lit from within by pulsing coils and floating spheres. Dozens of mechanical arms turned in slow motion, each one grinding against notched brass rings suspended in air. The entire chamber thrummed like a sleeping heart in the center. A throne, not meant for sitting, made of gears, wires, bells, and hanging above it by threadbare chains was a cage. Inside it, a child, no older than 10, pale eyes closed, breathing slow, but around him a storm of ticking. Gears whirled around his body, in patterns too precise for chaos. Some lifted paper-thin scrolls and read them aloud in rusted, whispered polish. Others recorded his breathing with inkless quills on glass, sheets that vanished into steam. Isabeau moved closer. The boy didn't flinch. She circled the throne, on the back of the structure. A wheel taller than her, carved with symbols she'd seen before in Vienna, Prague, Chartres, and at its base, an opening, empty, shaped like the stones she carried. She reached into her coat, for stones now, each warm. Each marked. She chose the one from Budapest, and pressed it into the slot. The machine shivered, the gears retracted, the bells turned, and the child's eyes opened, not human. Eyes. Clockwork, ticking. He didn't speak with his mouth. He spoke with time. One blink, then another, faster. She closed her eyes, and the room shifted. She stood in the same chamber, but it was whole new. The throne unbroken. The child laughing. Engineers moved about the space, robed in blue and gold, adjusting dials, tuning frequency rods. The boy was no prisoner here. He was the core. And then, a tremor. Sirens without sound. Lights blinking red. A woman ran into the chamber, face bruised, hands bleeding. "It's collapsing," she cried. "The archive is sinking out of phase." Men turned, panicked. One reached for the wheel, removed the anchor. The woman shook. Her head. "We can't. It's a child now. It can't be unbound." The others backed away, but she walked to the boy, knelt, and whispered something Isabeau couldn't hear. And then she placed a stone in his hand. Her stone, the one from Chartres. The memory snapped. She was back in the chamber. The child blinked again, and spoke. "You carry what they buried." His voice was mechanical, soft. "You were waking what was meant to sleep." She stepped closer. "What are you?" "I was a library. I became a key, then a lock, and now a mirror." She reached into her coat, and the child extended his hand, palm up. "I will return this, but not all at once." From his hand, a sphere unfolded, a miniature model of the earth, rotating slowly. 13 glowing marks. 5-lit dot. She touched one. It flickered. Not Krakow, not Chartres, but something in the north, cold, remote. He nodded. "The next is Rovaniemi." Finland. The machine around him began to wind down. Steam hissed. Bells reversed. The throne retracted. Into the floor, and the child. Gone. Only the ticking remained. She turned. On the wall, etched now in frost, were new words. "When the 13th mark burns, time will fold. You must decide whether to enter or turn back. Because what comes after was never meant to come again." She left the chamber slowly. The steps up felt heavier. And when she stepped into the Krakow snow, night had returned. The whole day had passed inside. But she had only been down for minutes. Time was unraveling, or re-aligning. She didn't know which was worse. At the station, she didn't buy a ticket. The train was already waiting. No engine, no conductor, just a single carriage. Door open, lit by a lantern glowing blue. She stepped inside, sat alone. The door closed behind her, and with no sound at all, the train began to move north toward snowfields, silence, and the 6th archive. She did not sleep. She listened, because now, the ticking was inside her, and it was growing louder. The snow in Rovaniemi was not snow, not really. It was silence made visible, falling gently across. A forest so old it had forgotten its own roots. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, their trunks whispering secrets. Only the wind could understand. Isabeau stepped off the final train and into stillness so deep. It swallowed sound. She was the only passenger. The carriage vanished behind her, no tracks. No ecogis or footprints forming a thin thread of presence across the white. The map had no markings beyond this, but her body knew. She followed the northern lights, weaving green and violet across the sky like celestial threads being pulled through a vast tapestry. She walked until her breath no longer fogged, until the cold no longer bit, and then she saw it. A circle of monoliths, 13 stones, each taller than a man, covered in glyphs, pulsing faintly. And in the center, a tower, not built, grown, metal and wood fused, as if time itself had wound its roots upward from the earth, shaping a spiraled spire crowned with a weather vane that spun against the wind. This was not an archive. This was the source, where all the stones had once come from, where they would now return. Isabeau stepped inside the tower. The door melted open. At her touch, inside, a spiral staircase with no center. Just walls lined with mirrors that showed not her reflection, but every version of her that had walked the archive path. She saw herself as a child in Chartres, watching her grandmother mend clocks. She saw herself in Vienna, kneeling beneath stained glass. She saw herself in Prague, speaking to shadows, and then at the top she saw herself now, older, worn, awake. The final door opened on its own, and there he was, the clockmaker. He had no face, only hands, literally. His head was a spinning orb of disembodied clock hands, ticking at random intervals, spinning in chaotic patterns. stopping and starting again. He sat in a chair of brass and ash, surrounded by timepieces, none of them synchronized. When he spoke, it was not with sound but with recollection. You brought them back. His voice was memory. 13 stones, 13 mirrors, 13 echoes. Isabeau stepped forward. Why? Because time is not a river, it's a knot, and knots must be untied or cut. We built the archives to hold what should not be remembered. She reached into her coat. The stones were glowing, burning against the lining like stars trapped in cloth. He nodded. You've come to choose. The knot is unraveling. If you finish the path, time resets. The archives collapse. Memory bleeds across all centuries. Past, present, future emerged. But if you turn back, if you bury the stones again, then no one remembers, not even you. Time remains safe and broken. Isabeau stood in silence. The wind outside had died. The northern lights no longer moved. She felt every archive in her bones, now like gears turning behind her ribs. She remembered every whisper, every flame, every locked room and sleeping mechanism. But most of all, she remembered the people. The monk in Chartres, who had waited for her across generations. The boy in Krakow, suspended in ticking sleep. The child, hidden under floorboards. The woman who had lit the lantern. If she turned back, they would be forgotten, forever. She looked at the clockmaker. Why me? Because your heart never ticks the same way twice. She smiled, closed her eyes, and let go. The stones lifted from her coat. 13 lights. 13 keys. They spiraled around her in a perfect circle. Faster, brighter, and then in a sound like a bell, unstriking, they vanished. The tower dissolved. The clockmaker bowed once, and then nothing. When Isabeau woke, she was sitting in the garden behind the cathedral in Chartres. Spring sunlight. Lavender blooming. A broken clock in her lap. But she knew how to fix it now. She touched the hands gently, and they began to move. One tick, then another. Time had not restarted. It had remembered. The archives were gone, but not lost, because now they lived in her dot, and in every timepiece she ever touched, and far away in Krakow, in Prague, in Vienna, in Budapest, clocks began ticking again. Not faster, not louder, just truer, aligned, awake.